Rob Port. Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. Later in the show, going to be interviewing Governor Doug Burgum. One of his proposals in his executive budget for this legislative session that's ongoing down in Bismarck right now, the 2019 session, was using some legacy fund dollars, about $50 million in legacy fund dollars. And when I say legacy fund dollars, I don't mean the principal, but I mean earnings from the legacy fund. Of course, the legacy fund is a fund created by oil tax revenues, but then the fund itself, which has right around $5 billion in it right now, is invested in various ways. Those investments produce interest, they produce returns, they produce revenue. And so Governor Burgum wants to use, all told, his budget includes some $300 million in legacy fund earnings spending, $50 million of which would be for a Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. Now, this proposal's been controversial. There's a lot of people out there saying, well, and really this is the sort of argument you can make about just about any spending, but they're saying, well, we don't need to spend money on the library, we need to spend money on X, and X could be whatever that particular person's concern is, mental health spending, education, roads, on down the line. But Governor Burgum's defending this, and he says it's a necessity for the state, and he says the moment is now. It's going to promote tourism, it's going to be great for the state. It's a very interesting debate, so listen to that. We spend about 15-20 minutes talking about it a little bit later in this program. But before we get to that, I have a couple of things I want to rant about. First, and this always bothers me, we just had the Super Bowl, which I'm not a football fan. I didn't watch it. I don't really have anything to say about the commercials or anything else that, a million other people aren't saying ad nauseum. And for the most part, I don't have anything to say because I didn't watch it. Don't really care. But it interests me whenever we have like a holiday or an event like the Super Bowl, like New Year's, like St. Patrick's Day or whatever, something that we know a lot of people are going to be drinking, we'll see news articles about DUI arrests. And sure enough, in the Fargo Forum, as an example, I saw a headline, few DUI arrests near Fargo on Super Bowl Sunday. Now, I guess that's a good thing. What bothers me about this reporting, though, is I don't understand why we're using arrests as the metric for like a good or bad Sunday. I don't know that arrests really tell us anything. Arrests aren't the goal of DUI policy. More arrests, I don't know, necessarily makes us more or less safer in terms of the roads. Now, DUI arrests are law enforcement exercising a tool that they have to make our roads safer, right? So law enforcement, if they think that you're under the influence of something, they can arrest you for that, and then they present their evidence, and then they get a conviction if they're right about it, or if they have the evidence. But that's not the goal in and of itself. Our goal when we made driving under the influence illegal was not arresting a whole bunch of people. Our goal was to make the road safer. And so to my point, there's a lot of things that can affect arrests that don't necessarily make the roads any safer. Let's suppose for a moment a number of scenarios based on a static number of drunk drivers. Let's assume that on a given night in a given city, there's going to be 100 people out drunk driving. Now, if you put more cops on the road, you're going to arrest more of those people. And maybe you could say, okay, well, we got more of them off the road, and that made us safer. But other things can affect it as well. The weather can affect it, right? So if the weather's really bad, maybe the police can't cover as great a ground, and, maybe more people get busted. My point is, our goal is fewer alcohol-related accidents. Our goal is fewer alcohol-related fatalities. We don't want those accidents to happen. We don't want those incidents to happen. So why are we so focused on arrests all the time? And I understand why. I guess I shouldn't say I don't understand. I do understand. It's an easy metric to throw out. I just don't think it tells us a whole lot. I mean, if we arrest in a given year, let's say we increase the number of DUI arrests by 50%, but the number of people who died in alcohol-related accidents stayed the same, or the number of people who got hurt, or the amount of property damage that was inflicted from alcohol-related collisions stayed the same, then what did we accomplish? If we just arrested 50% more people, what did we accomplish? I would argue not much. I don't necessarily know the solution for this. It's low-hanging fruit, I think, for reporters and for law enforcement to focus on arrests. I just think sometimes it presents a picture that's not very complete. Like most things, it's a lot more complicated than maybe you're getting from the news media. Now, staying on the topic of law enforcement, down in Bismarck, there is a debate right now over civil asset forfeiture. Now, this is the second legislative session, maybe more than that. I don't remember. But in successive legislative sessions, we've been debating the issue of civil asset forfeiture. Now, if you don't know what this is, you should Google it because it is a very controversial area of law enforcement policy. Essentially, what it allows is the government to take stuff that they believe has been involved in a crime. So if law enforcement believes that a large amount of cash that you have on your body was the result of a drug transaction, they can seize it from you. And essentially what they do is they initiate a civil proceeding, and then you have to show up in court if you want to get your property back and prove that it wasn't used in a crime. And if you can't do that, essentially they can keep your stuff. Law enforcement, in fact, literally keeps it. And a lot of times they'll sell it off and they'll use the revenues for themselves. Now, when I say law enforcement keeps it, I don't mean the individual cops are like buying themselves new jacuzzis with it. Although there's basically like the law enforcement agencies will keep it and they'll use it for equipment or training or whatever. But I mean, sometimes there's some nice perks. And in other states, I remember there was like civil asset forfeiture revenues. Cops bought themselves like an ice cream cone, like an ice cream dispenser and some other stuff. There's been some abusive ways or inappropriate ways in which that revenue's been used. I don't know that that's happened in the state of North Dakota, but suffice it to say, there is what many, including myself, including what the sponsor of House Bill 1286 have described as a perverse incentive. Now, I've interviewed Representative Rick Becker for this podcast. We talked about his bill, House Bill 1286, which would, among other things, put in place reporting requirements for civil asset forfeiture to tell, because right now we don't really have any idea how often this is being used, how much revenue it's creating for law enforcement. We know very little about it. So it would put in place some reporting requirements for that. Also, it would require a conviction in order for the forfeiture to happen. Now, the seizure could still happen. Law enforcement could still seize property they think was suspected in a crime. But once the person from whom the stuff was seized, or once, I guess, the crime accusation has been resolved in the courts one way or the other, then whether or not that property is seized is decided. So if cops pull you over and they think that you were involved in a drug trade and they took your car and they took your cash and then you were acquitted, they don't just get to keep your stuff. Now, sometimes they do that. Sometimes they still get to keep your stuff. As a matter of fact, there was a story here in North Dakota about a gentleman who was down at the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, and he was acquitted of his crime, but the cops kept his truck. Now, people who are familiar with my work know that I am no fan of Dakota Access Pipeline protesters, but still, I don't think law enforcement should just get to keep the property of somebody who was acquitted of the crime for whom they were arrested and charged. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this now is House Bill 1286 had a hearing before the House Judiciary Committee this week. And some law enforcement folks showed up and testified against the bill. Representative Becker obviously testified in favor of his bill. He made the perverse incentive argument. He also described this as sort of policing for profit. And one law enforcement official showed up, and this is his comments as quoted in the Grand Forks Herald are something that I wanted to respond to. The law enforcement officer was Sergeant Mike Bolme, B-O-L-M-E. I apologize if I'm not, or maybe it's Bolm. I don't know. I apologize if I am not pronouncing that correctly. But he showed up, and he disputed the idea of there being a perverse incentive. In fact, according to the report in the Grand Forks Herald from my Jack Dura at the Bismarck Tribune, Bolme described it. He said that argument was wrong. And this is what he's quoted as saying. He said, I quote, "To quote my extremely wise chief, we go where the case takes us. The evidence follows the case, not the other way around. To think otherwise is to not know the nature of investigating crimes." Now, here's the problem. what he is saying there is essentially is that there's no policing for profit because the police are just following the evidence. They're just following the evidence, and they're just following it where it takes them. But here's the problem. The way the law is currently situated, if the cops don't have the evidence, they can still conceivably keep the stuff. Again, if you are acquitted, right, if they charge you with a crime and you are acquitted of that crime, they could still forfeit some of the property that they seized from you because they think it was involved in the crime. They can still do that. Now, what Representative Becker's bill, again, what it allows is that it would allow law enforcement to seize the property. I think that's appropriate. If law enforcement suspects you were involved in a crime, they ought to be able to take some of your stuff until we figure out whether or not they're right. You know, so if we have somebody that they pull over on the highway and they find a bunch of drugs in the car and they find a bunch of cash in the car, they ought to be able to seize the car and they ought to be able to seize the drugs and they ought to be able to seize the cash and they ought to be able to keep it until those charges are resolved. But here's the thing. Now, granted, maybe somebody caught with drugs in their car. That's pretty slam dunk. Maybe that's a bad example. But here's the thing. If the person from whom they seized the property is acquitted, they shouldn't get to keep the property. Now, what's surprising to me is that law enforcement, they say that they're looking for a compromise in civil asset forfeiture reform. And I think what they would like in terms of a compromise, according to Dura's article in the Bismarck Tribune from February 4th, I think what they're looking for is something that still allows them to seize and forfeit property in absence of a conviction. And that shouldn't be how it is. The government shouldn't be able to just take your property and then force you to come into court and prove that your property wasn't involved in a crime. That should not be how it works. And what's disturbing to me is that this seems to be a trend of late, right? These civil proceedings where you're sort of guilty until proven innocent, right? For civil asset forfeiture, they can initiate a civil proceeding against your property, and then you got to prove that your property wasn't involved in a crime if you want to get it back. But then we also have, before this legislative session, something I've talked about a lot on the podcast, I've written about a lot in my columns and on the blog, this red flag legislation, which would set up a process through which law enforcement or even just a member of the public who is, you know, like a friend or a family of somebody can initiate a proceeding through which they could take your guns away, and then you've got to show up at a court hearing and prove that you're not dangerous to get them back. Again, the configuration there is guilty until proven innocent. That's not how it should be. Throughout history, right? Because a lot of times the law and order types, you know, they'll talk about all the, you know, oh, well, you know, if we don't have these tools, you know, the criminals are going to get away. They're going to hamstring our ability to get out there and get these criminals. And with the red flag law, you know, oh, it's going to stop our ability to you know, keep us safe and everything else. I mean, they make this public safety argument, and it's a compelling argument because we all want the public to be safe. We are the public. We want to be safe. I don't want criminals getting away with crimes. I don't want dangerous people to have guns. The problem, though, is that throughout history, the government has all the power. They don't need any more power. It's already difficult to find. I mean, a lot of times you think of the criminal justice system, and it's formulated where the government has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, and the accused is given the presumption of innocence. And you would think that would give an advantage to the defendant, but the problem is the state's already in charge of all the evidence, and they have pretty much unlimited resources to try a case, and you know, and everything else. And now on top of all that, the cops can take your stuff and keep it even if you're acquitted of the crime. Now, I suspect what's going to happen in the legislature, because our lawmakers are very, very deferential to law enforcement, is that because law enforcement's opposing this, they're probably going to kill this bill. And it's probably not going to go very far. And that should, I don't want to say make us feel ashamed, but it ought to make us think. Because you wouldn't think it would be a hard sell to lawmakers to say that the cops shouldn't be able to keep your stuff if they can't convict you of a crime. My interview with Governor Doug Burgum next. I'm here with North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, who, before we get into it, I want to talk with him about the Theodore Roosevelt Library, which was a part of his executive budget, which has created, though, kind of a lot of debate, a lot of reactions from it. I want to talk to him about that. But before we get into it, big press conference today on what's been a little bit of a sticky issue, but the sharing of oil tax revenues with our neighbors on our Native American reservation, specifically the MHA Nation. You had a press conference today about that, Governor. Tell us, what did we accomplish?
Well, big news today. And at the press conference, we had Chairman Mark Fox from MHA Nation, but we also had Senate Majority Leader Rich Wardner. We had House Majority Leader Chet Pollard. We had the minority leaders, Heckman and Boucher, all speaking in favor of the same bill. So if, people are concerned that bipartisanship and statesmanship's not alive in America, it's alive in North Dakota, because we had the legislative team that was all there endorsing a new approach. And it's really about moving beyond us battling each other about how to split up a small pie. It's how do we work together to enlarge the pie. And the way you enlarge the pie is when we're competing, when the Bakken is competing against Eagle Ford, Permian Basin, and other shale plays around the country and around the world, because we have, these are global companies that are deciding where to deploy their capital, and they make those decisions based on risk-adjusted returns, not just on where I can get the highest return, but part of risk is it a stable tax and regulatory environment? So the degree that we can create a single, consistent, stable tax and regulatory environment across the Bakken, whether you're on MHA land, trust land, fee land, state land, private land, deeded land, if it's a stable tax and regulatory environment, we're going to attract capital. And so today was the press conference was really about how do we enlarge the pie. And I think a great piece of legislation that's been worked on for over 2 years, being introduced and supported by all the leaders in both houses and by the chairman of Tax and Finance in both houses.
Well, it sure seems like we'll get progress, because we've got tribal leadership on board, we've got Republican leadership on board, we've got Democratic leadership on board, we've got the executive branch and you on board. I don't see how we can lose. So, and it just reading the details, it looks like a great compromise all the way around. I want to move on to the Teddy Roosevelt Library, though. This is something you've really been touting on. You just had an op-ed in the state's papers making the case for it, but there's been some pushback, and a lot of it. For instance, I'm looking at a letter to the editor in the Fargo Forum yesterday, written by a gentleman by the name of Jeff Ralph. Says, I quote, "There are several things the state needs more than a library." Most of the criticism I'm hearing of this, and by the way, I support building the library. I think it's a great thing to do. Most of the pushback I'm hearing, though, seems to be coming from people saying, hey, we've got other priorities other than a library. Why a library and not more pay for teacher? Why a library and not more funding for roads? Whatever the issue is, just a lot of people saying a library isn't a priority right now. How do you respond to these people?
Well, I think it's understandable, because we do have needs across the state, and most of the arguments that I would hear, if you're in studying debate class, those would be called a false choice, because we're comparing, A versus B when you actually could have A and B. And so the comparisons that some people are talking about aren't really viable comparisons, because in our budget we do have increases for teacher salaries. We do have $1.5 billion for roads. We do have money for building permanent infrastructure funds. We had money for fixing the pension fund for state employees, so that we don't have a revenue problem. And there's lots of ideas about how to spend every dollar. But I think we step back on this. The thing that's different this time versus any other time, and will be different every 2 years going forward, is we do have this thing called the Legacy Fund, with the citizens created. And we laid out an idea, a proposal, a vision that Legacy Fund projects should be one-time only funding. They should have impact that's regional, state, national, and international impact. They should last more than a generation. And if ideally, they would be leveraged by dollars from the outside. And then we stacked up a set of Legacy Fund projects against each other, as opposed to and all the legacy ideas were one-time only spending that didn't grow government. versus the other ideas on the other side of these comparisons generally has to do with the ongoing cost to continue or the cost to grow government and support ongoing operations. So trying to separate out the one-time only transformational projects funded by the Legacy Fund versus the other projects, which where there are many needs and I think included in our budget, including the largest increases for behavioral health ever included in a budget. So if we line up and say among the legacy projects, the ones that have this multi-generational, national impact, transformational, they can be leveraged one-time only spending, that there are a number of great ideas on that list. The one that has the most sense of urgent timing is the library and museum, which of course, as you know, is not just the library. Presidential libraries are major, I call them tourist factories, because they draw visitors. They've got educational components. They're not a repository for books. They're a place to actually emanate ideas and help shape how we think about the world today based on leaders' decisions in the past. And so this one is the one that is urgent because all the stars are aligning in terms of it happening now, and this may not be at all an opportunity that we have 2 years or 4 years from
now. I think that's exactly right. And yes, the presidential libraries are wonderful. If you get a chance to visit one of them, and they weren't a thing. They weren't in the reason why Theodore Roosevelt doesn't already have one is when he passed from office, when he passed away, it wasn't something that we were doing. It really kind of started with, Franklin Roosevelt, I think, was actually the first. But they're wonderful. The Reagan Library, for instance, in California, I visited in Simi Valley. Wonderful place. I mean, they have a full replica of Air Force One because of President Reagan's association with the Air Force One. It was just a wonderful, wonderful place. I mean, it's a legitimate tourist attraction. I mean, there's an academic function and a historical function that is fulfilled as well. But I think a lot of people, to your point, Governor, are looking past the fact that this is a true tourist attraction. People will come to see this. People like this stuff. People will come to see this, and it would be a year-round attraction in Medora. It'd be wonderful.
Yes, and of course, from a tourism standpoint, I mean, one of the things we know that tourism is often quoted as the third largest industry in our state, but it is a way to diversify our economy away from the commodities of agriculture and energy. So having a stronger tourism industry in our state would be great. And of course, right next door, South Dakota has got a much more robust tourist industry than we do. And one of the things that they have is I mean, you're watching the Super Bowl and they're, playing the Star Spangled Banner. And when they've got, the Golden Gate Bridge on one end of the country and the Statue of Liberty on the other, you can just wait for it. Oh, here it is. There's an aerial view of Mount Rushmore. I mean, they have the iconic element that's there, 2.4 million visitors that are interested in presidents. And we think we can pull hundreds of thousands of those out of South Dakota up to North Dakota and convert those into paying tourists. So I think that's certainly one of the elements that's here. And in doing this right now, not just with private donors, but when we have this idea, we have an opportunity working with the federal government. Our federal, our two senators, our congressmen are all supportive of this idea. They're ready to go fight for dollars out of the Department of Interior, which has the ability with the bill that passed last year. I mean, we could have as much as $20 million of federal funding that flows in to upgrading Painted Canyon, upgrading the visitor center. The vision would be the visitor center of the Theodore Roosevelt Park would actually be embedded in this building. So you'd have the library, museum, and visitor center would be one thing. So visitors to the park would likely pay a ticket you want the ticket for the park, or you want the ticket for the park and the presidential library. And having that kind of refresh to our park, which really hasn't had any capital investment since the 1960s, would also be fantastic alone because, right now Painted Canyon is the number one visited spot in the state, 700,000 people. And they have a pop machine there. I mean, we're not converting either tourists or dollars there. And that should really be the front door to the park and the front door to all the other attractions, including State Historical Society attractions that are based out of Medora.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Now, do you think part of these? I think some of some of the opposition that I have seen is also grounded in the fact that you're using legacy funds dollars for this. Now, the legacy fund was created. As a matter of fact, I'm interviewing your predecessor and supporter during your campaign, former Governor Ed Schaefer, who was very much a supporter of the legacy fund. But the legacy fund is an issue that sort of makes its own weather because we have this big pot of money. It's also just big principal just from the oil tax deposits that are flowing into it. And then it in turn is generating, big revenues in terms of earnings. And there's a lot of there's no defined purpose for it at this point. And so there's a lot of wrangling about that. Do you think that's where why did you choose to use the legacy fund dollars for this? And do you think that you maybe invited some more opposition that you wouldn't have gotten if you hadn't chosen to use legacy fund dollars?
Well, great question and great debate. And it's a fun one that we get to have as a state because we're so fortunate the voters had the wisdom and the vision and those in the legislature that supported it to actually do this because it's fun that we have an opportunity to have a debate every 2 years about what legacy projects we should do next. I would certainly agree with Governor Schaefer strongly, as and Lieutenant Governor Sanford. We don't want to spend a dime of the principal of that core principle. That principle should just keep growing and going. And it's at about $5.7 billion today. It's growing at $50 million a month on average. And so for the proposal that we have for the library, and some people have said, well, don't spend the earnings till you have them. In the library proposal, the $50 million from the legacy fund would form the endowment for the library. It wouldn't go towards construction or exhibits or the creation. It would go towards the endowment that would allow for covering ongoing maintenance and operations, and so that the library would have a sustainable base going on for the next 20, 40, 50, 100 years. I mean, the national park will be there in 100 years. I would expect this library will be there in 100 years. But for the timing of that endowment, the money could come out on June 30th of 2021, which is the last day of the next biennium. So we would have an opportunity for the legacy fund to continue to accrue all the way to the end, accrue earnings. And so we take $5.7 billion with over 2 years of deposits at $50 million a month. The legacy fund, by the time we draw the $50 million out, will be a $7 billion fund. And if you're taking even really conservatively 3% annually, you could be, drawing $210 million a year out of that. So 420 in our budget, we only proposed 300. So we were only proposing about 2% of the legacy earnings, coming out of the legacy earnings amount to come out of that as a percent of principal. And so we were very conservative in our proposals, and some of the ideas we floated probably won't make it out. And in the larger context, the entire budget for the next 2 years is $14.3 billion, and every dollar matters, but $50 million of one-time spending is a third of 1% of the budget. And so again, back on the false choice, I mean, virtually anything that somebody says we need more funding, we can find a way to do that and still do the library and do this one-time transformational element. And then of course the piece is its leverage, the $50 million that only comes out from the state 2.5 years from now, if the Library Foundation has raised $100 million in private, federal, and in-kind matches before that time period. So, I mean, I tell you, if every time there was a legacy fund project where I could spend $1 of future earnings 2.5 years from now, and that would drive $100 million of capital into the state now on a 2-for-1 basis, I would do those deals over and over. Because as an investor, I'm trying to figure out how do I take a dollar of taxpayer money and turn it into $3. This is one of those ideas.
Last question. You said that there's no, this is a one-time funding thing. And you said that's a very important criteria. If we're going to use legacy fund dollars, it not be about creating more government that we then have to uphold. It's about one-time investments. You're saying the library is this. I think I understand what you're saying, but just to be clear, for people who are thinking, well, we're building a library, somebody's going to have to maintain it. Where's that money going to come from? How is this structured so that this isn't an ongoing expense?
Well, the $50 million endowment that would be created for the library through the legacy fund earnings, that could throw off, again, if you're saying that that's going to throw off 4% a year, that would generate about $2 million of income coming off of that endowment that would be in perpetuity, that would help pay for operations and maintenance. But in addition to that, you've got ticket fees, you've got merchandising, you've got media opportunities, because there could be content that would come out of the Theodore Roosevelt Library and Museum, in terms of whether they're, webcasts, podcasts, movies, symposiums, naming rights. I mean, there's all kinds of things that could. So there's going to be revenue opportunities that are generated for this thing on an ongoing basis. Because again, I think Roosevelt and what he did, which I think is an important thing, is he was really about rugged individualism. He was really about the opposite of the way some of our national dialogue is going today. And I think that his life, his legacy, his policies, his decisions are more relevant than ever in the current debate. And I'm confident that that's going to be an important part of this going forward, is shaping not only how we think about ourselves as a state, but how, he transformed himself, and then he went on to transform a nation. And I say, when he transformed a nation, he transformed how the U.S. thought of itself, and he really set up the U.S. for the entire 20th century was shaped by the decisions he made at the beginning of the century. And it's an important story to tell, and the tie back to North Dakota and how North Dakotans helped shape him is a story that needs to be told. And we have an opportunity to tell it. But I think with that important storytelling, there's going to be a lot of revenue opportunities over time that would keep this thing alive and vibrant and going, like I said, for the next 100 years.
Well, I think you're right. And I think we see a trend where certain eras of history become fashionable for a while. World War II has been sort of fashionable for a while. World War I think, is sort of coming back. Roosevelt's era is, I think we're right on the cusp of coming in where it's going to be very, very important in the next couple of decades. I think this is very, very timely. Governor, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rob.
Today's episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is now over. I know, it's very, very sad. Hey, one news note, starting this week, and you'll hear them in episodes coming up, this week, Senator Kevin Cramer and Congressman Kelly Armstrong will be on the program on a regular basis to take your questions. Now, if you want to get questions to them, you can email them to me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. When they're on, I'll ask them the questions. You can get responses. This is a way to keep them accountable, a way to keep them in touch with what your concerns are. You'll have access to them every week, and I'm more than happy to ask your questions, whether I agree with your politics or I like your question or not. I'm going to read them. So if you have them, send them in. Also, don't forget, new episodes of the Plain Talk Podcast are released Monday through Friday, every morning, right away in the morning. So if you want to listen in the morning, you want to listen in the afternoon, that's the great thing about podcasts. You can listen when you want to listen. Follow me on social media. You can find me at Rob Port on Twitter, at Say Anything Blog for the blog posts. You can find me on Facebook. Just search for Rob Porter, Say Anything Blog. All new episodes of the podcast are posted on those feeds as well. So if you want to follow that way, you can. Or if you want to subscribe and have the podcast delivered to your various devices, you can certainly do that. Go to sayanythingblog.com. Click on the Plain Talk Podcast link. All the information to subscribe via RSS, Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, all of them, they're there. And again, use that email if you want. If you're hearing something on the podcast you like, something you don't like, you want to give me some feedback, you're having trouble subscribing, email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. And heck, just say hi. I like it when people say hi. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.